Pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Jan Ference. I'm going to read from the bio. Jan Ference has a bachelor's and master's in counseling, infant parent mental health fellow, has spent the majority of her career working with at-risk children. She completed her Bachelor of Education at the University of Victoria before moving to Vancouver, where her first teaching job was in an intercity school. After learning about Dr. Bruce Perry's Neuro Sequential model for working with at-risk children, Jan was inspired to change her practice and the systems that serve the most vulnerable children. After 6 years of NMT training and certification, she is now an international mentor supporting and training others. In the past year, Jan has been leading a specialized early intervention trauma team serving Port Hardy, Alert Bay, Campbell River, and the Comox Valley. This project is a community collaboration involving Children's Health Foundation, Island Health, Ministry of Children and Family Development, and Child Development Association. Jan has also recently completed an infant parent mental health fellowship through the University of California. Please join me in welcoming Jan.
I'm so thankful it's not my job to deal with that part of this event. Thank you so much for having me. It is a true honor to be here. And I have to say that trying to convey some kind of important message to you in 40 minutes is tricky. I like to talk. Anybody that knows me knows I like to talk. And I look forward to the session this afternoon with those of you that can be with me a little bit longer. In addition to the time frame being challenging, I feel like this is such an amazing opportunity that I really wanted to think very deeply about what I wanted to say to you today. So hopefully I've come up with something. I usually go a little bit rogue, so bear with me. The PowerPoint is just, I don't know, maybe to keep me on track. I'm not sure if it'll work. So there's a couple key messages that I want to leave you with today, and I totally agree that coming to a conference like this is medicine for all of you. Connecting, being inspired. I go to conferences myself to do the same thing. So I think that one of the things I want to really say clearly today, from a scientific perspective, which is the perspective I take about brain development, that hope really changes everything for you and for the families and children that you work with. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a gross research story that will convey the science behind hope and why it is so important for all of us, not just the kids and families that you work with, but for us as well. So it's going to be about rats, sorry. So an interesting study that was done, for those of you that love rats, I'm not one of them, so it doesn't bother me so much, but I apologize to those people who are rat lovers. No rats died in this study, just so you know. So what they were doing, this is something Dr. Perry did when he was quite young, but I think it's just such an interesting thing to think about. They had some rats in a lab, and what they wanted to do was he was always trying to figure out what the biological mechanism of stress or in this case, hope, which is nice to be looking at the other side of it. So what they did is they had some rats in the lab, and they had a large bucket of ice water. And they put the rats in the water to see how long that they could swim. And as the rat was starting to be challenged with it, they would just take the rat out. And what they did as a comparative study, and this is the part that's the good news, they took another set of rats and they put them in the water, and at specific intervals, they would take the rat out of the water and give them like a little pat on the head, like a little, I'll call it a rat snuggle. And then they, if there is such a thing, it's not for me, but for some people, we'll call it a rat snuggle. And they put the rat back in the water. And the difference between the timing that it took for the rat that they gave the rat snuggle to swam forever. They basically had to stop the study because the rat kept swimming. So, and they also measured all the biochemical things that happen in the rat's brain to create more science around all of this. But my message about that weird rat story, is that if you have just the littlest interaction with someone who's kind and loving and supportive, you might swim forever. A little bit of brain science, because I can't help myself. So I think we all, the exciting thing about the last, I would say, 2 years with the work that I've been doing is that it feels like brain science is becoming a common language. And I think the interesting thing I was thinking about as I was listening to the other speakers this morning is that this movement of exposing violence and exposing racism, which is an unfortunate thing, but at least we know it's there. All of that movement, there's actually, I feel like there's this momentum of science to support how to heal from all of those things. And so we have this movement of people starting to talk and feel supported enough to say, me too. And now we have this really interesting wave of interest in how we actually heal the brain. And the perspective that I come from is that brain development and what happens to you from the minute you're conceived as a human being has an incredible impact on your function and your ability to deal with stress. So whether you're the victim or whether you're the person that inflicted pain on someone else, it started somewhere. And I love the theme of motherhood that we heard this morning because in my mind, sorry to the men, I really apologize, but in my mind, mothers, whether you are a biological mother or not, mothers, aunties, the nurturing capacity that women have to offer children who have been through violence is incredible. And that's where the healing happens. I have this pilot project that you've heard about on Vancouver Island, which is going very well, I might add. It's very exciting to see what we're doing. And we took referrals from a number of sources that were children of all ages. But what's happened is we've started to get attention for the work we're doing with pregnant women. And so we are working very intensely with pregnant women who have addiction history, who are living often in violence as well, and for sure living in poverty. And what we're finding is that if we can provide this incredible support for women at that stage of their parenting, the outcomes are just incredible to see what happens. And it's all related to allowing that baby's brain to develop in a different way than her brain developed, and maximizing this incredible opportunity we have when you have a baby to change your own patterns. Your brain has this weird thing that happens when you give birth, where if you don't have neural pathways around attachment from your own infancy, there's this oxytocin opportunity when a baby is born. And so we are taking that window and we are just going for it. And it's amazing what people can do and the changes they can make in their life when you actually maximize that. The interesting piece about oxytocin is that if you have too much cortisol, which is the stress hormone many of you know about, if you have too much cortisol at the same time that you're trying to develop oxytocin pathways, it's like, this is my goofy analogy for it. I think of cortisol as like a little devil floating around, and oxytocin as like an angel, beautiful angel floating, making everybody feel good and fall in love. Cupid, we'll call it. The devil basically punches out the angel if they are coexisting at the same time. So I think that the importance of reducing stress for women at that point is just so key. And I think that when we are talking about ending violence, which is what we're here for, I was thinking last night to myself as I was looking through my PowerPoint and just making sure I was organized in my thinking. Usually when I speak to people, many of you are from similar groups that I would normally speak to, but just the name of this organization has a movement to it. It's not the Association for Social Workers, or not that that's bad, but ending violence has an action. And that to me is so exciting. And yeah, why I was like really honored to be asked to speak here, because I'm all about action. I'm probably a little kind of calm and quiet right now, but my professor in California refers to me as a mosquito in your tent. So, zzz. Like, oh, you said no? You said no to that? Really? Oh, too bad. Okay, I'll wait a day and then I'm going to ask you again. Which is kind of how we make change, right? That's how we get policies to change. And that's how I got this grant from the Children's Health Foundation, is I just kept asking. Okay, I'm going to bring it back to what I am here to talk about. So when the brain is developing in a pregnancy, which is this extremely important time of development, the first 2 months of life is also an incredibly important time. If you think of many of the children and families that you work with, the time that they were born, or even the pregnancy, when they're surrounded by chaos and violence and unpredictability and fear, that baby's brain is already being wired to see the world as an unsafe place. So what we're at risk with that chemical bath in the pregnancy, what we're at risk for is creating another generation of children who are living in fear, who are wired for fear, essentially. And then in addition to that, they either become a victim because they're vulnerable, or they may likely become someone who actually goes out and becomes violent. And the way that I look at all human beings from this perspective, nobody really wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to beat my wife today, or I'm going to be a victim of violence today. People don't wake up with those thoughts. There's a very small percent of the population that may actually have some of those really horrid thoughts, but most people don't. So what is it then? What's happening? It's about your brain function. Our brain is pretty much driving everything you're doing right now, whether you're sitting quietly, whether you're getting a little bit irritated because you have to go to the bathroom, whether you're hungry, whether you're worried about leaving your kids at home when you come to this conference. All of those things and your ability to stay regulated and focused right now has to do with how your brain is wired. Some of you are way better at it than others. I'm not the best at sitting still for very long. You probably will know. I often will go stand at the side. But that's just how I'm wired. So Dr. Perry's model is called the Neurosequential model, not to flub up for people who have to introduce it, because it really is something that's like, a what? Because our brain develops in a sequential way. And it develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. And why does that even matter to any of us? The reason that it matters is because when a child is growing up in an environment that causes them to have a lot of stress, their brain development is meant to kind of chug along. We all know there's certain milestones, kids do things at a certain point in their development, and all of that is kind of predictable. But the challenge is when that developmental process is interrupted. And usually it's interrupted by a biochemical mess that's happening. The child is getting not enough oxytocin and too much cortisol. The same thing, the pattern just keeps going around and around. It's like a biochemical disaster zone. So when that child gets to the school system or gets into a situation where they're overwhelmed and they have explosive behavior, I don't even like to use the word behavior actually, because I think of it as a function. So what is their brain doing that causes them to kind of function in a particular way or not be able to manage an environment? And so when we are thinking of how to help the families that we all work with, I think that the mistake, I would call it, that our system has set us up to do is that we have an expectation that everybody's brain is online and working well. I don't know whose brain is working well when they've just come out of a domestic situation. Certainly their brain is not functioning. They're not thinking clearly. Sometimes they're making poor decisions, which often can frustrate people. They're often flighty, confused, can't remember the details. There's a reason for all of that. And for any of the law enforcement members in the crowd, I just think of trying to get information from people when you're trying to piece a story together of what happened so that you can, create safety for that person. I'm sure people have lots of different strategies of trying to get the story, but if you think about how hard it is to think straight when you're in that situation or you've just come out of that situation, and why the stories don't always line up. Like, I think that's one thing that happens to victims of violence all the time. Well, the story's different than it was yesterday, and it's a judgment. It's not a judgment. There shouldn't be a judgment. It's how their brain is working at that point. None of us are smart when we're scared. It's just a fact. And none of us are smart when we're overwhelmed even with excitement. Our brain is really sensitive to what we're going through in that moment, and also what we've been through in the past. So if a child is growing up in an environment, or a parent has grown up in an environment with violence and chaos and stress, their brain develops, if you think of it like a muscle. So it develops in a use-dependent way, and it develops patterns. The brain only has, we'll call it, only has so much like memory, or so many filing cabinets, we'll call it, just for an analogy that simplifies it. So if you have an experience that is repetitive in a violent, scary, you're living in fear, it's really common for those kind of people to go into a situation, like we think of kids that go into foster care after they've been living in a home that wasn't safe for them. And everybody's like, oh, thank God they're safe. Oh, like everybody's relieved. And of course, that's the right thing to do to keep them safe. But the child gets into a safe, predictable, loving home, and they lose it. This happens all the time. This happens in the world of adoption. It's the core reason why the foster care system is so challenging for the children and the caregivers. It's almost like saying to someone who's had a dairy allergy until they're 6, that you're good now, you can actually start drinking milk. And so they go home and they have a bucket of ice cream and they eat some cheese, and you can imagine what happens. It's not pretty. It's kind of the same idea. If you have a lifetime, your brain has developed in a use-dependent way, which means you expect the world to be unsafe, unpredictable. You don't really trust people. Maybe there's a particular kind of person that you trust, and it's just from an experience. But mostly you come into the world thinking you have to be hypervigilant, you have to protect yourself, or you actually have to go inside yourself to survive. And then you go into, the foster home that's full of love and excitement and style, like nice clothes, and you've got this whole thing going on. These kids, it's so difficult for them to adapt. And whenever people come to me with a case like that they want to talk about, I always encourage them just to take baby steps. Take baby steps for that child. It's too overwhelming. It's too much. The challenge with the brain is that it is meant to protect us. So we actually our brain is wired to react and to protect us and to keep us alive. And back in caveman days, that was actually very helpful, because we needed to be able to run away from a predator, we needed to be able to hide, we needed to pretend we were dead, we needed to do all kinds of things. Because human beings don't have any sort of armor to protect themselves. All we had was each other and our brain to make a really good decision when we're scared. So we're kind of set up to be reactive. And I think that when we're thinking about people that have been through adversity, it's really helpful to think about how that brain has been perceiving the world and trying to adapt how we speak to those people. It's so easy to kind of, this happens with children who are losing their temper. When people say, why are you doing that? What happened? Use your words, calm down, stop crying. You hear all these kind of things, and they can't. Their brain is actually causing them to do whatever it is they're doing, and it's there for a reason. So the complexity of the brain, I think we all know, is extensive, and I don't think we even really know how complex it is. And when you're thinking about people getting support and help for emotional issues, it often goes to some kind of diagnostic thing, and that drives funding often, which is just the way our system works. We can't really avoid that. But if you just have a little peek at this slide and think about how complex the brain is and how few ways we can describe what it is that's going on. So this is one of Dr. Perry's most common slides. If you've seen anything to do with him or ever heard him speak or read his book or looked on his website, this picture comes up. And it's really a simplified version of the brain. And the reason that he's created this is so that we can kind of be thinking about where certain functions are and how complex they are, and hopefully adjust our expectations of how people respond. I think the interesting thing for the field when you're working in some sort of community of care, like many of you are, is that we have this expectation that the attachment and relationship that we have with these folks is going to be kind of the thing that's going to help them, especially in a crisis. And sometimes we go into a situation, you get called and you find out one of your clients has been through something horrific and you want to be there for them. And sometimes they call you because you're their person, you're their main support person, and they've got a good trusting relationship. And as a care provider, that feels good to know that you have that. And so you get the call and you go to this, wherever it is this person is, maybe the hospital or wherever they are, and you go to visit with them and check in with them, and they're really losing it. And people are hoping that you're going to be the magic touch that's going to bring them back to some sort of regulated state. And you get there and you go in with the expectation that you're going to go in with your relationship to help them in that moment. And you get there and you get a completely opposite reaction. You get a rejection, you get a volatile answer, you get, extreme, they swear at you, they throw something at you, and it's a stab in the heart. But what I want you to know, just looking at this diagram, and those of you that are going to spend the afternoon with me will talk a lot more about this, but just for this particular crowd, if you look at how far up and how complex attachment and affiliation is in the brain, it's a complex thing to access your relationship and your attachment. Even just affiliation, where you feel like, okay, I remember this person, they have my back. It's not a simple thing to do. So when someone's in a crisis, sometimes it feels like your relationship isn't the thing that is meaningful, or you start to question yourself. I would stop doing that. From this perspective, if you think of how hard it is to access that part of your brain when you're overwhelmed and stressed, and when they are calmer and they have a bit of time to bring that heart rate down and their adrenaline starts to dissipate, they'll remember who you are. This happens a lot with educators, where a child is losing it in a school and they get called as the kid whisperer. It used to happen to me quite a bit. And I would go wherever, and sometimes I was met with a lot of negativity, and it was like, oh, stab in the heart. But it's actually just in that moment they can't access that part of their brain. They're being pushed to act in a way that is basically like in their reptile brain, in their brain stem. So I'm just going to have a little bit of a rant about where we spend our money in our systems, because I can't help myself. Maybe there's some government people here and they're going to listen. If we just think of how we organize our systems and where we end up spending the money, and how does that maximize the potential that we all know are in those young children and families. A mother who has been through a lot can be a different kind of parent if they have the right support. They can do it. I see it every single day. They can change their own brain. That's the exciting part about science. Science is teaching us that our brain is plastic. And if you're an adult, obviously you have way more established patterns. It may take longer for you to change the brain of someone who's been like that for a long time, but it can be done. But when you have an infant, or you have a young child or a toddler or a school-age child, there's all the hope in the world. So for anybody who influences policy or where people spend their money, I feel like our systems are starting to understand that. That's one way to break the cycle of what you guys are trying to do. It's one way to end the cycle of violence, is to think about the babies. It's where it starts. I think attachment actually is everything. And if we don't think about it like that, we're just having another generation of kids growing up without that opportunity. It might seem like I think stress is really just bad across the board. Stress is actually good for us. When you're learning something new, when you're pushing yourself to do something different, when you have the stress of a situation with support, it creates resiliency. But for many of the children and families that you all work with, they're under incredible stress. It's not predictable. They have no control over their own environment or their own life, and that's where we get vulnerability. The brain actually likes some forms of novelty. I mean, many of you probably feel really excited when you've learned something new. It's a good thing, but for many people, it's completely out of control for them, and they have no way of managing that. So one thing that I'm sure many of you see in the work that you do, dissociation is a topic that gets way less attention, we'll call it, than people who are externalizing their emotions. So when someone is hyper-aroused, it's the people that you can picture where they're aggressive, they're yelling, they have no control over their kind of what they're saying and how they're acting. But many people, especially young children who've been through the kind of things that you all support, they actually have some people have a completely different response to that, and some people have both. But for people who have a dissociation as their kind of coping mechanism for dealing with fear and stress, those people often get missed. And so I always challenge people to be thinking about those folks that you might see or children that you see. It's probably a little bit easier to see in children where they have this kind of like flat affect. They seem kind of numb and indifferent. I'm always worried when I know a child has been through a lot and they're overly compliant. Have you ever seen those ones where you're just like, wow? And people be like, oh, she's doing amazing. I don't know if she's doing amazing. She's just completely shut down. And it's often girls that are the ones that are more dissociative. So I think it's really an interesting thing because when you have extreme dissociation, it can lead to all kinds of other things when kids hit adolescence that is very concerning. I had a young girl that I worked with. I ran an inpatient unit in Calgary for traumatized children, and we were supposed to only take kids up to the age of 13. So this young girl was 12, and she was probably about like this, and her feet were like this. And when she got upset, she definitely had both of these patterns. When she got upset, she would sometimes try and put her foot through my coffee table in my office. And sometimes she would become so dissociative. But the pattern that happened when she was dissociative was this incredible pattern of self-harm. And it took me a while to kind of figure out what that was. But if I watched her closely and watched her cues, you could see that she was gone. She was gone. She wasn't present. She had gone completely inside herself. So we always give attention and try and figure out what to do about the kids that are externalizing or the adults that are externalizing, but there's this whole other population. So this is a way to kind of categorize what happens to people when they get overwhelmed. And I would say that many of your families that are living in fear, you can see how far up this continuum, this is called the stress response continuum, how far up this continuum someone who's living in fear. So if you have a baseline experience of the world where you are constantly living in fear, that little number at the top, 3, arrow 1, you're basically functioning like a toddler. That's what that means. So if you have a baseline experience of the world where you're constantly living in fear, or you're either fearful or just even alarmed, you're like a child. So I always think one of the clear messages you can give to people who have those ridiculous questions, like why does she keep going back to him? Or why does she keep finding another man that does the same thing? A toddler would not make a very good decision. A toddler wouldn't be able to think through what they're doing. A toddler would just get what they want to get. Toddlers are like that. When you're an adult living in fear, you are not capable of making the best decisions. So you're just reactive. You're just surviving. So I think it's a really perhaps helpful way to shut down that conversation when people have judgment about why people don't leave or why they go back. We also set people up to have no other option. One of the biggest barriers I see to people changing their life is housing. I don't know if many of you have the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. So what are they supposed to do? They're going to lose their kids because they don't have a place to live? It happens. So they go back to the place that they shouldn't go. And it happens again and again and again. Yeah. It's not uncommon for people to have their babies apprehended because they don't have housing. I don't know what that's about. Something I am working on. Thank you. Yeah. So the challenge that I put to you, because you are in this amazing organization that has movement forward, ending violence, is up to all of us. And I think the story of the little grandson saying that it's rude to be mean to girls is exactly the kinds of things we need to do. All of us go and we do our work and we are moving this forward in our own ways, but I think the conversation needs to spread. The Me Too campaign, I think, is really powerful. In my mind, is very powerful. I had an old friend from high school actually send me a message on Facebook and ask if we could meet for coffee, and he had a memory of something he thought he had done that might have been offensive to me, and he wanted to clear it up. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but let's just say it's a long time ago. But I was so honored that he would think of that, and he just said, I have so much respect for you. I don't want to ever think that I did something that was offensive or out of line. That's a tiny example of something that's happened from that. But I think this movement, we have an opportunity. What did you say, Tracy? Last year you said the time is now. I actually think the time is now, because we have this movement of exposing the truth about what's going on behind closed doors. And we also have this movement of people not accepting that trauma is okay. I just spent the last 2 days at something called the ACES Summit, an event that was over 600 people. They had 150 people on the wait list. The Doctors of BC, thank you, timekeeper. I saw that. It's very helpful. The Doctors of BC organized this event, and it's all based on the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which many of you have probably heard of. If you haven't, it's interesting to look up. But basically, what the message is from the physicians, which I think is amazing, is they're starting to accept that early adversity in people's lives has incredible health outcomes, not good health outcomes, as you can imagine. The correlation between physical health and emotional health, we all know that. I actually want to say hello. This study is 30 years old. I'm just saying. I was like, have a little giggle to myself every time they get all worked up about it. It's like, okay, good, you guys are coming on side, a little slow. It's a little slow, but I'll take it. But there's 600 people in the room, many of them medical professionals, that are ready to take this on. So the sectors that normally I think didn't really, we've always gotten this. People that work in this field, we have always gotten this. We know that trauma is bad. We know that it has lasting effects. We know people can pass it on from generation to generation. We know all that. But the exciting piece for me is that other sectors are saying this is unacceptable. We have to do a better job. And the reason the doctors want to talk about this, which I think is really heartwarming, is because they want their patients to feel known by them. It's amazing. So I feel, because I'm obnoxious that way and sticking my nose in every possible corner I can, I want to get a sense of this movement. Because if everybody that works with children and family, it doesn't matter who they are, including the bus drivers and the custodians, I actually took on our driver testing licensing branch in my community. Like, why do people have to do a driving test with sunglasses on and treat the person, this little like nervous, anxious mom who just had a C-section and can't push her baby carriage, who's living in this chaotic life? She had a vehicle, she just needed a license, but the guy was so rude to her all the time that she would fail the test. So I went down there and had a little talk with him, and she has a driver's license. So, that's what we need to do. If people have had a hard start to their life, they have limited tolerance for people treating them that way. This is my dad's term, their spider senses are up all the time. They know when people are judging them. And it just sets off this cascade of stress for them that they sometimes can't come back from. And they fail their driver's license. Like, she used to save up her money so she could go again. I was like, just took one conversation, and the guy I think he was actually embarrassed about how he had acted. So I challenge us all to think about the brilliance and importance of our children, especially the babies. I'm all about the babies these days. Because if we change that generation and we support their brain development in a different way than we have, by supporting their caregivers, we have a chance to change the trajectory of the entire family. The project that I'm working on came from actually wanting to quit my job working in the school system. I felt like I was working really hard, my community partners were working really hard, and we were all kind of moving forward. I was just starting my work with Dr. Perry, and I was trying to use these brain maps and get everybody pumped up, but I didn't see any difference in what I was doing. And so I thought, okay, I have this theory that I love, and I have people that want to try things differently, but there's just something missing in the middle. So the reason I have been a mosquito in the tent to get this funding is because I have 2 staff that work with me, and they go everywhere that these families need them to go. So one of them is a birth doula, so we have a number of our women on our caseload who've had babies, and she's at the hospital when they have their baby. If you're a drug user or you come in with bruises, there's all kinds of judgment that happens. Nurses are lovely people, but they just don't know what they don't know. So these women come in and they're treated in a certain way. And can you imagine the birthing process actually stops when people get overwhelmed and stressed. So there's so many ways to buffer these things, and it's powerful work. So being that team that just basically navigates the system for these families is having an incredible impact. So we actually have the power because we have a cortex. Yay, that means we're smart. We're the only mammal that has a cortex. Isn't that exciting? It actually means we can be thoughtful about what we want to pass on to the next generation. We've all decided as a community that reading is important, so we have great literacy programs. We can also make that decision about ending violence. We can decide, I think all of us are on board, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think as a larger community, we can decide that enough's enough. And there's so much information now about how to heal. The interesting thing I think that people are also starting to get, I only have 5 minutes and I've got something cool to do at the end. Okay, I'm going to say this really quickly. The interesting thing that I think also is happening, and maybe you feel this as well, is that we're not wired biologically in our history, in our ancestors, to live alone and to do this ourselves. We're not meant to be alone in parenting. We're not meant to be alone in healing. We're not meant to be alone. It's just not how our brains work best. We're meant to be together. We have much more power to change things together. I think you all know that. But what I try and do with our families is I try and remove all the professionals that are their support system over time and place natural supports in there. People know, I've had people, you've probably had this too, where they say the only people that I feel like are my friends are people who are paid to be here. It's kind of awkward, right? So eventually, we need to pull our community together. There's grandmas that will help, there's aunties, there's uncles, there's brothers. We pull those people in and we can make all the difference. And our brains love it. Oh, all this stuff I don't get to talk about. It's so sad. So I think this is just an important thing to think about. You know, everything we do that changes the trajectory of a baby, you know, women are born with their eggs. So babies have their future children right there on board. So whatever we're doing for that infant has an extreme impact on future generations. The other thing that I want you to know from a scientific perspective is that every single thing you do, every smile, every nod, every hug for each other today and tomorrow, but also for the families and children you work with, actually has an impact on their brain chemistry. So for someone who's had a lifetime of negativity and people they can't trust, so what I want you to think about is that even if it's a smile, or even if you see someone from across a room and you give them a wave, you're still getting a little biochemical burst of goodness in your brain, the angels floating in your brain. And so for people who have had limited experiences of that, the power of what you can offer by those I'll call them micro interactions, which maybe you don't even think about, have such power. So keep doing them. Okay, here's our commitment together. I already said the first one. Obviously, we are taking a stand, speaking for people who can't. What happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Take care of yourself. Be a renegade just like me. Come on, guys. Okay, this might make you cry, but this is what we're going to do. The time is now, as Tracy said. We're going to rise up, and we're going to do this together.